Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. I don't know why I chose the house on Sycamore Lane. Maybe it was the charm of its faded Victorian facade, or perhaps it was just a desperation to move on from my old life. The divorce had left me drained, emotionally, financially, you name it. The moment I saw the ad online, it felt like a sign. Affordable rent, historic charm, quiet neighborhood. It sounded perfect, and I needed perfect. The day I arrived, the house looked every bit as old and weary as I felt. Peeling paint clung stubbornly to the wooden siding. The shutters hung slightly askew, and the front porch sagged under the weight of its years. But despite its flaws, there was something oddly comforting about it. It felt like a fresh start, or so I thought. The real estate agent, a wiry man with thin, darting eyes, handed me the keys with a forced smile. "A lot of history in this place," he said, his voice flat, almost rehearsed. "Been empty for a while. People tend to come and go." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I figured it was just one of those houses, a bit too old-fashioned for most people's taste. I was wrong. The first week was uneventful. I spent my days unpacking and my nights sipping cheap wine on the creaky front porch. The house had its quirks, sure. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and a faint, musty odor lingered in the air no matter how many candles I lit. At night, the wind whistled through gaps in the windows, and the occasional thud or creak would jolt me awake. But I chalked it all up to the house's age. One evening, as I was lugging a box of books up the staircase, I noticed something odd. The hallway on the second floor felt colder. Not just a drafty chill, but a bone-deep cold that prickled my skin. I paused, shifting the box in my arms, and glanced around. The air seemed heavier, thicker somehow, but as quickly as it came, the feeling vanished, leaving me questioning if I'd imagined it. By the time I met the neighbor, Mrs. Connolly, I'd almost forgotten about the strange cold spot. She was an older woman, the kind who wore floral dresses and oversized glasses, and always seemed to be watering her plants. "You're brave, moving into that old place," she said one morning as I walked to my car. I stopped, keys in hand. "What do you mean?" Her smile wavered, and she glanced toward my house. "Oh, nothing, dear. Just people say things. Old houses like that tend to have stories." I laughed, trying to mask the unease creeping into my chest. "Stories? Like what?" Mrs. Connolly hesitated, her gaze flitting back to me. "There were rumors about the man who built it. He was strange, into things he shouldn't have been, if you believe the talk. And then, of course, there were the tenants. Some left in a hurry. One family didn't even take their furniture. Said they couldn't stand the noises at night. Noises," she nodded, her expression unreadable. "Footsteps, voices, that sort of thing. But don't worry, dear. I'm sure it's just nonsense. Old houses make sounds, you know." I forced a smile and nodded, but her words stuck with me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, I thought about what she'd said. Footsteps, voices. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was just an old house. Old houses creak and groan. That's all it was. At least, that's what I told myself, until the noises started. The first time I heard it, I was half asleep. It was around midnight, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen below. I'd been drifting in and out of sleep when a distinct sound snapped me awake. A slow, deliberate creak coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom. My heart jolted. I sat up, straining to listen, but the sound didn't repeat. It was probably just the house settling, I told myself. Still, I got up, switched on the bedside lamp, and padded over to the door. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by a weak bulb that cast long shadows across the faded wallpaper. Nothing seemed out of place. I shook my head and laughed softly to myself. "Get a grip, Claire," I muttered, closing the door and crawling back into bed. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, just beyond the door. The noises came again the following night. This time, I was wide awake. I'd stayed up late scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like fingertips drumming on wood. It seemed to be coming from the staircase. I froze, my stomach twisting in knots. The sound was so faint that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But then it stopped, and a moment later, I heard the floorboards creak. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping cautiously out of bed. My breath caught as I peered into the hallway, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The house was silent again, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I crept toward the staircase, my pulse pounding in my ears. The light from my phone illuminated the steps, but they were empty. I stood there for a long moment listening before retreating to my room and locking the door. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd been hearing things, or maybe the sounds had a perfectly logical explanation. But deep down, I knew better. Something about this house wasn't right. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Lights flickered for no reason. Doors that I was certain I'd closed were found ajar. And then there was the smell. A faint but unmistakable scent of something rotting, like spoiled meat, that seemed to come and go. I tried to ignore it, bury myself in work during the day and distracted myself with TV at night. But the house wouldn't let me forget. One evening, as I sat on the couch flipping through channels, I heard a loud thud from upstairs. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and cautiously climbed the stairs. My hands were shaking as I pushed open the door to my bedroom. Everything looked normal at first. The bed was neatly made, the dresser untouched. But then I saw it. The closet door, which I always kept shut, was wide open. I froze, staring at the dark interior of the closet. My mind raced. Had I left it open? No! I was sure I hadn't. I took a step closer, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The smell hit me then, stronger than before, like something decaying. I held my breath and reached for the closet door, slowly pulling it all the way open. The tiny space was empty except for a few boxes, but the smell was overpowering. That night, I barely slept. I kept the bedroom light on, my eyes fixed on the closet. Every little sound set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I decided to pay Mrs. Connolly another visit. She greeted me with her usual warm smile, but her expression darkened when I mentioned the noises. "I knew it," she said, shaking her head. "I told you that house wasn't right. Do you know anything about the man who built it?" I asked. Mrs. Connolly hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "He was an odd one," she said finally. "Henry Blackwood. He built that house back in the late 1800s. People said he was obsessed with strange things, the occult, rituals, that sort of nonsense. There were rumors about him holding seances and summoning spirits. Some even said he made a deal with the devil." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happened to him?" "No one knows for sure," she said. "One day he just disappeared. Some people think he went mad. Others think whatever he was messing with got to him." Her words stayed with me as I walked back to the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I lay in bed, the noises started again. This time, they were louder, heavy footsteps echoing through the halls. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed a friend. But before they could answer, the call dropped and the screen went black. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, my heart pounding as the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob turned slowly, the faint metallic squeak slicing through the silence. I sat frozen on the bed, gripping the phone like a lifeline. My throat felt tight, and I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the doorknob stopped moving. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, waiting, barely daring to breathe. The air in the room was suffocatingly still, and the faint scent of rot hung heavy around me. I mustered what little courage I had, grabbed the candlestick from my bedside table, and crept toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. With a deep breath, I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The dim bulb overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. My legs felt like jelly as I stepped into the hall, peering left and right. Nothing, but the air was thick, like something unseen was lingering just out of sight. I checked every room, turning on every light as I went. The house was empty. No intruder, no sign that anyone had been inside. But the unease wouldn't leave me. By the time I crawled back into bed, it was almost 3 a.m. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, my dreams were restless and fragmented. I dreamt of dark corridors, of whispers I couldn't understand, and of shadows that moved on their own. The next morning, I decided I needed answers. I couldn't keep brushing off what was happening. I dug through the boxes in the attic, hoping to find something, anything, that might shed light on the house's history. The attic was a cramped, dusty space with low beams that forced me to hunch over. A single, grimy window let in just enough light to see by. The air was stale, and every movement sent a cloud of dust swirling into the air. Most of the boxes were filled with junk. Yellowed newspapers, broken furniture, and old clothes that smelled faintly of mothballs. But then I found it. A small, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a pile of rotting fabric. The cover was cracked and faded, but the initials HB were still visible, embossed in gold. My heart skipped a beat. Henry Blackwood. I carried the journal downstairs, my hands shaking with anticipation. Sitting at the kitchen table, I opened it carefully, the brittle pages threatening to crumble under my touch. The handwriting inside was neat but spidery. The ink faded to a dull brown. The first few entries seemed mundane. Accounts of the construction of the house, notes about the weather, and mentions of Blackwood's interactions with townsfolk. But as I read on, the tone shifted. June 12, 1891. I conducted the first ritual tonight. The symbols were drawn perfectly. The incantation spoken with precision. The air in the room grew thick, charged with energy I cannot describe. Something was there. I could feel it, but it remains just out of reach. I must try again. July 3rd, 1891. I have heard the whispers. They come at night, soft and indistinct, but undeniably real. They call to me, urging me forward. The sacrifices will be worth it. Sacrifices? My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, skimming for more clues. The entries became darker, more frantic, as Blackwood detailed his experiments with summoning rituals and his obsession with piercing the veil between worlds. August 19th, 1891. The barrier is thinning. I saw it tonight. A shadow in the corner of my eye, a presence that pressed against my very soul. It wants to come through, but it requires more. I must give it more. The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. September 5th, 1891. It is done. The door is open. It watches me now, always. I hear its laughter in the walls, feel its breath on my neck. There is no escape. I have made my choice, and now I must live with the consequences. The journal ended abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. What had Blackwood done, and what had he let into this house? That night, the house felt more oppressive than ever. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind, sent my nerves into overdrive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. They started in the hallway, slow and deliberate, growing louder as they approached my room. I clutched the journal tightly, my eyes fixed on the door. The footsteps stopped just outside, and then with agonizing slowness, the doorknob began to turn. This time, I didn't wait. I leapt out of bed, threw open the door, and screamed, "Who's there?" The hallway was empty, but the air was ice cold, and I could swear I heard faint laughter, low and guttural, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I slammed the door shut and pushed the dresser against it, my heart pounding like a drum. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head. As I sat there, trembling, the journal fell open in my lap. My eyes landed on a drawing, crudely sketched but unmistakable. It was a symbol, jagged and angular, surrounded by strange runes. Beneath it, Blackwood had scrawled a single word, bound. Bound to what? Or worse, who? The days after finding Blackwood's journal passed in a blur of dread and paranoia. I couldn't get his words out of my head. The door is open. It watches me now, always. Those weren't just the ramblings of a deranged man. Something was here, and whatever Blackwood had unleashed wasn't going to let me ignore it anymore. I spent my time obsessing over the journal, reading and rereading the entries until I could practically recite them. Each page was a breadcrumb, leading me deeper into the mystery of the house. The symbol Blackwood had drawn haunted me. It felt alive, like it was burned into the back of my eyelids every time I closed my eyes. I tried to research the symbol online, searching for any connection to the occult or rituals, but the results were frustratingly vague. Mentions of ancient rituals, entities older than time, and cryptic warnings about meddling with forces beyond comprehension. None of it made me feel better. The footsteps continued every night, always at the same time. Midnight. They never ventured further than my bedroom door, but the sound of them, heavy, deliberate, was enough to make me feel like a prisoner in my own home. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something, anything. I waited until the next afternoon, when the oppressive atmosphere of the house was slightly less suffocating, and ventured into the basement. I hadn't spent much time down there since moving in. It was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew. The single light bulb overhead cast long, wavering shadows across the stone walls. The basement felt older than the rest of the house, like it belonged to a different time. The floor was made of uneven stone slabs, and the walls were lined with shelves cluttered with tools and forgotten belongings. As I examined the space, something caught my eye, a patch of the floor that looked different from the rest. The stones were smoother, arranged in a perfect circle, and carved with faint markings that I couldn't quite make out. My heart sank. The journal hadn't mentioned a basement, but I had a sinking feeling this was the place Blackwood had performed his rituals. I crouched down, running my fingers over the carvings. The stone was cold to the touch, and as I traced the symbols, a strange sensation washed over me, like an electric charge humming just beneath the surface. I didn't know what compelled me to do it, but I pressed my palm flat against the center of the circle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the air around me shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint pressure, like the room was holding its breath. Then came the sound, a low, guttural whisper, so soft I couldn't make out the words, but loud enough to set every nerve in my body on edge. I scrambled back, my heart pounding, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the voices were coming from every direction. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Just stop!" The whispering ceased instantly, leaving the basement in an eerie, suffocating silence. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, but the stillness was worse than the noise. It felt like the house was watching me, waiting. I bolted upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me, but the unease followed me, clinging to me like a second skin. That night, I sat on the couch, clutching the journal, and tried to make sense of what had happened. If Blackwood's rituals had opened some kind of door, how could I close it? Was that even possible? The answer, I realized, might lie with my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway. She'd lived in the area for decades. If anyone knew more about the house's history, it was her. The next morning, I knocked on her door. She answered quickly, her kind eyes narrowing slightly when she saw me. "You look pale, dear," she said, ushering me inside. "Is everything all right?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. "I've been hearing things in the house, strange noises, and I found something, an old journal that belonged to Henry Blackwood. Do you know anything about him?" Her expression darkened, and she crossed herself instinctively. "Henry Blackwood was a wicked man," she said. "He dabbled in things no one should. People said he was obsessed with the occult, that he believed he could summon things." She shuddered. "Things?" I pressed. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Spirits, demons, shadows that don't belong in this world. There were rumors he performed sacrifices, that people went missing around the time he lived there." My stomach churned. "Did anyone ever see anything? Anything unexplainable?" Mrs. Calloway nodded slowly. "There were stories. Tenants who fled in the middle of the night, claiming they heard voices or saw figures in the dark. One man swore he saw Blackwood himself, long after he died, standing in the hallway, smiling. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What happened to them? The tenants. Some left town. Others disappeared." Her gaze was heavy with unspoken fear. "If you're smart, dear, you'll leave that house. Whatever's in there, it's not something you can fight." Her words echoed in my mind as I walked back home. Leaving sounded like the most rational thing to do, but part of me couldn't. I needed answers. That night, as I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, I felt the shift again, that subtle, almost imperceptible change in the air. The house seemed to hum with energy, like it was alive. And then, from the hallway, came a voice. It was soft, almost melodic, and undeniably human. "Why won't you listen?" My blood ran cold. The voice stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I froze, my breath caught in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it just a wind? Or was the house playing tricks on me again? I forced myself to stand up, my legs unsteady beneath me. The voice was real. I knew it was. It was soft, almost comforting, but the words, they felt like a warning. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, straining to hear any sign of movement. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. There were no creaks in the floorboards, no distant sounds of the house settling, just that suffocating silence. I glanced toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The last time I'd heard those footsteps, they had been coming from the upper floors. This time, the voice had come from the hallway. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. No answer. I took a few steps forward, each one slow and deliberate, as if I feared the floorboards might betray me and reveal where I truly stood. The smell of decay lingered in the air, mingling with something else now, something sharp and metallic, like the tang of blood. I moved toward the kitchen, hoping to find something familiar, something normal to ground me. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I saw it, a shadow. It was darker than the rest of the room, hanging just outside the doorway, like it was waiting for me. I froze. It didn't move, but I felt it, its presence, pressing against me, suffocating the air around me. There was a heaviness, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart thudded in my chest. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, or if the house had made it disappear, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I turned quickly, making my way back to the living room. But the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways as I passed. They were following me. I hurried up the stairs, my feet nearly tripping on the creaky steps, and slammed the bedroom door behind me. My hand shook as I locked it. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The house had become a prison, its walls closing in on me, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't just outside my door. They were moving in the hallway again, slowly and methodically, as if whatever was walking out there was savoring the moment. The sound grew louder with each passing second, until it felt like something was right outside my room. Then a knock. Not a soft tap, but a sharp, deliberate knock on my door. I jumped back, my pulse skyrocketing. The knocking continued, again and again. No voice this time, just the sound of wood meeting wood. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen in place. Finally, I reached for the doorknob, my mind racing with 1,000 possibilities of what I might find on the other side. But I couldn't open the door. Something was stopping me. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was a stillness that felt unnatural. Then came the whispering again, faint, but there, swirling in the air around me. Come to me. I staggered back, my heart thundering in my ears. I felt the coldness again, seeping through the cracks in the door, filling the room. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. The house had become too much. The fear, the shadows, the voices. It was all too much. I grabbed my things in a panic, shoving clothes into a bag without even thinking, only half aware of what I was doing. The house seemed to close in around me, pressing me with an invisible weight. But as I reached the front door, I hesitated. The house had been quiet for a while, too quiet. I looked over my shoulder, my hand on the doorknob. It was almost as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. I thought of Mrs. Calloway's warnings, how the house had claimed people before, how it had made them vanish without a trace. And I realized with a sickening certainty that leaving might not make it stop. I turned back around slowly, the bag heavy in my hands. My thoughts swirled in a haze, but one thing was clear. I couldn't just leave. I had to understand what was happening. I had to confront whatever was here. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled deeper into something dark, something that had been waiting for years. The house wanted me to leave, but I wasn't about to give it that satisfaction. I set the bag down and walked back to the living room. The air was thick with tension, almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, and the silence was deafening. Then I saw it again, the figure. This time, it was standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, and shrouded in darkness, and it was watching me. My breath caught in my throat. My feet moved before I could think, rushing toward the kitchen. The front door could wait. I needed answers, needed to find out what Blackwood had left behind, what he had unlocked in this place. I grabbed the journal once more, flicking through the pages in a panic. I found a drawing, one I hadn't seen before, a circle of symbols, the same one etched into the basement floor. In the center was a figure tall and skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the page. At the bottom, written in frantic scrawl, was one final note. Do not open the door. It has come. The words on the page seemed to burn into my mind as I stared at them, my heart hammering in my chest. Do not open the door. It has come. I had thought the house was already tormenting me, but now I realized that something far worse was waiting. The journal had been clear, but there was a chilling sense of inevitability in the air. I had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. I felt the temperature drop in the room. The coldness seeped deeper into my bones, an unnatural chill that wasn't just from the draft. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the silence pressed in like a heavy weight. It was suffocating. I tried to steady myself, gripping the journal tighter as I tried to focus on the next page. But the words were blurred, as though the ink was running. I rubbed my eyes, desperate to understand what I was reading, but the text refused to make sense. It was like the house itself was rewriting the story as I looked at it. And then the whispers started again. At first, it was just a murmur, barely audible. But it didn't take long for the sound to grow, a low, guttural tone that seemed to reverberate through the walls. I turned toward the source of the sound, my chest tightening. The kitchen door had swung open on its own, and a shadow, blacker than night, stood just beyond the threshold. It didn't move, but it didn't need to. The air grew thick, charged with something malevolent. I tried to call out, but no words came. I was frozen in place, my mouth dry, my mind racing for some explanation, something to make it stop. But I knew deep down that there was no rational explanation. I had awoken something in this house, something that had been waiting, watching, for who knows how long. The shadow in the kitchen flickered, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. They echoed through the empty house, each step a reminder of how alone I was. I forced my legs to move. I couldn't stay here any longer, but as I stood up, the room seemed to tilt, the floorboards creaking beneath me as if they were groaning under the weight of some unseen presence. I stumbled forward, trying to reach the door, but the moment I touched the doorknob, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could hear the faint sound of scratching from the other side of the door. A low, continuous scratching, like something was trying to claw its way through. I yanked the door open, panic flooding my veins, but there was nothing there, just the darkness, swallowing everything around me. The house had changed. I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears, and I saw it. At the end of the hall, standing perfectly still, was the figure I had seen earlier, the one that had been watching me from the shadows. This time, it was clearer. Its eyes were hollow pits, black and endless, and it was taller than anything human. Its limbs were impossibly long, twisted, like they didn't belong to any living thing. The air seemed to distort around it, as if reality itself was bending, warping in its presence. And then it moved. The footsteps were deafening now, each step a thunderous sound that reverberated through the house. I ran. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was away from whatever that thing was. I reached the stairs and bolted up them, my legs weak, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. I knew, somehow, that if I stopped, I wouldn't make it out of this house. The floor groaned beneath me with every step I took, but I didn't look back. I just ran. I burst into my room and slammed the door behind me, throwing myself onto the bed in a desperate attempt to catch my breath. My heart was hammering, my body drenched in cold sweat. I thought I was safe, thought I had made it, but then the bed shifted. It wasn't a creak or a shift in the mattress. No, this was a weight. Something had sat down beside me. I froze. My eyes shot open, and there at the edge of the bed, I could see the faintest outline of something barely visible in the dark. Something was sitting there, its presence palpable. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. And then the whisper came again. "You're not leaving." I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing together, the shadows growing, moving toward me. The figure next to me shifted. I could feel the coldness of it, as though the space beside me had dropped in temperature by several degrees. It leaned in closer, and I could smell it, an awful, rotting smell, like something long dead. "Please," I whispered, but even the word felt weak and useless. It didn't matter. It was already too late. I heard the low growl from behind me, and then the unmistakable sound of scratching again, this time coming from the walls, like nails on wood, scraping closer and closer. And then I felt it, a hand, cold, wet. It pressed against my back. I jerked away, but it stayed. It was relentless. The pressure against my skin was unnatural, wrong, like something was trying to pull me into the bed, into the darkness, into whatever lay beneath. I scrambled to get up, but the hand tightened its grip, pulling me back. I clawed at the sheets, desperate to break free, but the pressure intensified. There was no escape, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The hand was gone. The bed was still. The whispers faded into nothingness. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind reeling. What had just happened? Had it been a dream? Was I losing my mind? But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone. The house had me now. I didn't sleep. How could I? My mind raced in circles, replaying everything I had just experienced over and over. The pressure on my back, the whispers, the figure sitting beside me. None of it felt like a nightmare. It was too real, too vivid. I couldn't shake the sensation of something lingering in the room, waiting. The sun had barely started to rise, casting a weak light through the dusty windows, but it did nothing to chase away the chill in the room. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to ignore the cold that clung to the air like it had a life of its own. The house creaked and groaned, but it didn't sound like settling anymore. It sounded different. It sounded alive. I needed answers. I couldn't just stay in this state of constant terror, not knowing what was happening to me. I had to find out more about this place, about the curse, the rituals, everything. But where could I go? Who could I turn to? Then it came to me, my neighbor, Mrs. Simmons, the old woman who had said something about the house's dark past. Maybe she knew more than she let on. I forced myself out of bed, my legs unsteady as if the ground beneath me was shifting. I didn't care. I had to find out. I had to know what I was dealing with. I grabbed my jacket, slipping it on despite the heaviness in my chest, and made my way down the stairs. The floorboards creaked as they always did, but today they felt different. The sound seemed to echo longer, more pronounced, as though they were warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. Not now. I knocked on Mrs. Simmons's door, my hand trembling as I pulled it away. There was a long pause, and then the door creaked open. She looked at me, her face pale, eyes sharp, as if she had been expecting me. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice raspy, a knowing tone behind her words. I nodded, too stunned to speak. Mrs. Simmons stepped aside, beckoning me in with a slow, deliberate gesture. I hesitated but then entered, unable to turn back now. The room was dimly lit, with the heavy curtains drawn tight, keeping out the daylight. It felt as cold as the house I had come from. "You should have listened to me," she continued, her voice low. "That house, it's not just old, it's cursed. The man who lived there before you, Thomas Holloway, was obsessed with the occult. He dabbled in rituals, trying to summon things. You need to leave before it drags you down like it did to him." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What happened to him? I managed to ask. Mrs. Simmons's eyes darkened, and she sat down in a worn armchair, her frail hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He opened a door he shouldn't have," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "A door to something far darker than he could ever understand. And when it came through, it took him. He wasn't the first, and he won't be the last." I took a step forward, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean, took him?" She closed her eyes for a moment, as if the memories were too much to bear. "I heard him. Late at night, he would scream. Not like a man, though. Like something else. I saw him run out of the house once, screaming about a curse, babbling about things coming for him. But he never left. He was pulled back in. And then one day, I didn't hear him anymore. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The pieces were starting to fit, but the picture they painted was one of horror, not salvation. And what about the footsteps? The cold spots?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Are they part of it?" She nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as if the memories were clawing their way back to the surface. "Yes, the house has a life of its own now, a hunger, and it feeds on fear. The more afraid you are, the stronger it gets. The footsteps, the cold, it's just the beginning. If you stay, it will consume you, like it did him." I stumbled back, trying to wrap my mind around her words. I had thought I was losing my mind, but now I realized it wasn't just me. The house was doing this to me. The house, and whatever was trapped inside it. "I don't know how to leave," I said, my voice barely audible. "You leave by breaking the cycle," Mrs. Simmons said, her gaze piercing. "You have to find the door he opened, the one he tried to seal. It's hidden in the house, somewhere no one would think to look. And if you don't destroy it, it will continue to claim everyone who steps inside that house." I felt a wave of nausea hit me. The thought of going back in, knowing that whatever had taken Thomas Holloway was still there, waiting, was enough to make my legs buckle beneath me. But I couldn't just walk away. Not after everything. I nodded. "I'll do it. I'll find it." She gave me a grim smile, but it didn't reassure me. "You'll have to be careful. The house will fight you. It doesn't want you to find it. And when you do, you may not make it out alive." I swallowed hard. "I have to try." Mrs. Simmons looked at me with pity in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of fear in her gaze too. She knew the truth. Whatever was inside that house was not just a ghost or a curse. It was something far worse. As I left her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the window, waiting for me to return. I didn't want to go back to the house. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me inside, but I had no choice. The door was open, and I had to go through it. The moment I stepped back inside my house, I felt it again, this suffocating weight in the air, the sense that something was wrong. I had to find the door. I had to figure out what Thomas Holloway had done, what curse he had unleashed, and how to stop it before it swallowed me whole. I walked cautiously through the hall, listening to the house creak around me. It was like the walls were alive, shifting and groaning, making me question whether I was truly alone. The place felt colder than before, colder than it should have been, even with the furnace running. It was a chill that seeped into my bones, like an invisible hand gripping my spine. I didn't know where to begin my search. Mrs. Simmons had said the door was hidden, somewhere no one would think to look. What did that mean? A hidden room? A trapdoor? I walked from room to room, feeling the temperature drop further with each step, my breath visible in the frigid air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The footsteps, they were back, soft, distant, like a phantom moving through the house. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to the house settling, but the footsteps were too deliberate. They were too real. As I passed the staircase, I glanced up. There, at the top, I saw it, the shadow. It was just a glimpse, barely noticeable, but it was enough. A tall, dark figure standing motionless at the top of the stairs, its features obscured by the darkness of the hallway. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs, and my legs felt weak, as if the ground beneath me was crumbling away. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I should have turned and run. I should have left the house right then. But something in me, the part of me that wanted answers, kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't back down. Not now. I forced myself to climb the stairs one slow, agonizing step at a time, my breath shallow and quick. The figure remained at the top, its presence more oppressive the closer I got. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing or what I was imagining. When I reached the top of the stairs, the figure vanished. Not a trace, nothing, just a silence. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more terrified. The silence was worse than the footsteps, worse than the figure itself. It was the absence of sound, the oppressive stillness that seemed to pulse in time with my own heartbeat. I stumbled down the hall, my eyes darting from one dark corner to the next. I had to find the door. I had to end this. I stepped into the first room on my left, the master bedroom. It felt different. I couldn't explain why, but it did. As soon as I crossed the threshold, a heavy sense of dread settled in my chest, like the air itself was thick with something unnatural. The room was exactly as it had been when I moved in. Furniture in place, bed made, but something wasn't right. The closet door stood ajar. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't been in the room long enough to even think about it. But there it was, slightly open, as if inviting me inside. I approached it slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The air grew colder as I got closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I pushed the door open. Inside, the closet was empty, save for a few coats and boxes. But against the far wall, something caught my eye, something faintly out of place. It was a small crack in the wall, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. A dark seam in the plaster that seemed to stretch all the way to the floor. I leaned in closer, my breath catching. The crack wasn't natural. It was too perfectly straight, too deliberate. It looked like something had been hidden behind it, something sealed away. I ran my fingers over the crack, feeling the coldness of the wall beneath my touch. The crack wasn't just a crack. It was a doorway, an opening that had been hidden for years. I could almost hear it calling to me, beckoning me to uncover whatever lay beyond. With a sharp breath, I pressed my palm against the wall. To my surprise, it gave way, crumbling slightly under the pressure. I pushed harder, the wall shifting in place, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside, there was nothing but a dusty old journal. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. The journal looked ancient, like it had been forgotten for decades, hidden away from prying eyes. I pulled it out, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew, deep down, that this was it, the answers I had been searching for. The journal was the key to everything. I flipped it open, scanning the first few pages. The handwriting was erratic, hurried, as though whoever had written it was losing their mind. It wasn't long before I found what I had been dreading: the rituals, the incantations, the terrible experiments that Thomas Holloway had attempted in his obsession with the occult. He had been trying to open a door to another world, a world filled with things that should never be let in. The journal detailed his descent into madness, how the rituals began to work, how the entities he had summoned had started to take form. But something had gone wrong. The last pages of the journal were barely legible, covered in what looked like blood stains, the ink smeared across the page. One sentence stood out: "The door will never close. It will always be open, waiting." A chill ran down my spine as I closed the journal, realizing the terrible truth. The house had become a doorway, a portal, and I had no idea how to shut it. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the journal in my hands, the weight of its contents pressing down on me. My head was spinning, my thoughts tangled in a web of terror and disbelief. I could feel the temperature in the room drop even further, the air thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart. I had to do something. I had to stop whatever had been unleashed in this house before it was too late. I walked back into the hallway, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The house felt different now, alive in a way that it never had before. The creaking floors beneath my feet seemed to groan with anticipation, as if the house itself was aware that I had uncovered its darkest secret. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching me, following my every move. The footsteps returned, soft at first, then growing louder. They echoed through the house, just behind me, as if someone or something was walking in my footsteps. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow, and I fought the overwhelming urge to look behind me. I couldn't give in to the fear. I had to stay focused. I needed to find a way to close the door, to stop the curse from spreading. But where was the door? What exactly was it? Was it in the walls? The floor? The journal had hinted at it, but it didn't provide any concrete answers. It was maddening, knowing the solution was so close yet feeling so far away. As I walked down the hallway, I saw a faint glow coming from the stairs. It was strange. There had never been any lights on, and the house was supposed to be pitch black at this hour. I hesitated at the foot of the staircase, unsure of what to do next. The glow flickered, then disappeared, only to return moments later, brighter this time. Against every instinct telling me to run, I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. It was as though the house itself was breathing, exhaling its icy chill into the air. As I reached the top, I saw it there at the far end of the hallway, the door to the room where the journal had led me. I walked toward it, my steps slow and deliberate. But as I approached the door, I felt it, a pressure in the air, as if the room itself was pushing back against me, refusing to let me in. The door creaked open by itself, and I stepped inside. The room was cold, colder than it had ever been before. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the wood like they had been burned into place. The floor was littered with remnants of old candles and incense, their faint, burnt scent still lingering in the air. It was as if the room had been untouched for years, but at the same time, there was an overwhelming sense of presence, as though something had been waiting here for me. In the center of the room, there was a large wooden chest. It was ancient, the wood dark and weathered, but it was also strangely beautiful, its intricate carvings telling a story that I couldn't understand. I approached it cautiously, every step heavy with dread. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I had to. Whatever was inside held the answers. I took a deep breath and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but dust. Dust and a single object, a small ornate box. The box was made of some kind of dark metal, covered in more strange symbols, the same ones that adorned the walls. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the air growing heavier with each passing second. The moment my fingers brushed against the box, I felt it, a jolt of energy, like a current of electricity running through my veins. The house seemed to tremble, the floor beneath me shifting as if the very foundation was breaking apart. I pulled the box out of the chest and held it in my hands. It was cold, far colder than it should have been. The symbols on it seemed to shift and move as I stared at them, almost alive. I could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on me, and a voice inside my head whispered a warning. Asterisk, you've gone too far. There's no going back, asterisk. My heart raced. I couldn't let it end like this. I had to find a way to stop whatever was coming, but I didn't know how. The house was closing in around me, the walls pressing together, the shadows growing thicker, more suffocating. Suddenly I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, louder this time and growing closer. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The hallway outside was empty, the shadows shifting in unnatural ways. The footsteps continued, though, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Panic surged through me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let whatever was in the house catch me. I turned to flee, but before I could make it to the door, a cold hand closed around my wrist. The touch was ice cold, a grip that felt like death itself. I screamed and tried to pull away, but the hand tightened, dragging me backward into the room. The box slipped from my grasp and crashed to the floor, its lid falling open with a sickening thud. And then I saw it, the door, the one I had been searching for. It was wide open now, an inky blackness beyond it, as if it led to nowhere, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The hand pulled me closer to the threshold, the cold so intense I could feel my skin starting to freeze. My body was fighting, desperate to break free, but I couldn't escape. The presence in the room, the thing that had been waiting, was far stronger than I was. With a final, desperate effort, I wrenched myself free. I stumbled backward, my body crashing into the wall. The hand released its grip, but the darkness beyond the door still called to me, its tendrils reaching out, as if it was waiting for me to step forward. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway and out the front door, slamming it behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled across the yard, not looking back, not daring to glance at the house. But even as I ran, I could still hear the footsteps, still feel the cold presence following me, creeping in the shadows. It wasn't over. The door hadn't closed. Whatever had been unleashed was still out there, and it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't know how long I ran for. The night seemed endless, and the air felt like it was closing in around me, thick and suffocating. My mind was a mess. Disjointed thoughts racing through my head like fragments of a nightmare. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The only thing that mattered was getting away. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, following me. I reached the edge of the property, the old iron gate creaking as I pushed through it. But as I stepped onto the street, something stopped me. A heavy weight settled in my chest, and I felt my stomach turn. The sound of footsteps had followed me, echoing in the darkness. Not just behind me, but all around me, circling, never letting me escape. I turned around, expecting to see nothing but the empty street behind me. But there, at the end of the block, stood the house. The lights were on, flickering through the windows, as if someone was still inside, watching me. A chill ran down my spine, and I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't escape. The house had never truly let me go. I should have kept running, kept going until I couldn't run anymore. But my legs felt like they were made of stone. The footsteps stopped, but the air felt alive with something I couldn't explain. It was as if the house was calling me back, its dark, invisible fingers reaching out, trying to drag me back inside. I couldn't breathe. The panic was unbearable. I couldn't go back. I couldn't face whatever had followed me out of that place. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, the same creak that had echoed through the house that first night. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the house, the one I had fled from, was open, waiting. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go back, but I also couldn't escape. My feet moved before my brain could process what was happening. The pull of that house was too strong. It had already sunk its claws into me, and I was helpless to resist. I walked back toward the house, my every step dragging me closer to the inevitable. The closer I got, the stronger the pull became, like the house was alive, its heartbeat matching my own. The lights flickered again, and I could feel the temperature drop even more. The air grew colder still, and my breath turned to mist in front of me. I reached the front door, and it creaked open wider, as though inviting me in. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I crossed the threshold. Inside, the house was as it always had been, silent, still, but there was something different now. The shadows seemed darker, thicker, as though they were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I stepped deeper into the house, my every instinct telling me to leave, but my body moving against my will. The footsteps had returned, louder this time, closer, more insistent. But there was something else, something new, a voice, a whisper that echoed through the house like a broken record, repeating the same words over and over again. You shouldn't have come back. I froze, the voice sending a chill down my spine. It wasn't my own thoughts. It wasn't even the house itself speaking. It was something else, something trapped within the walls, something ancient and dark, something that wanted me to stay, to become a part of it. I looked around, desperate to find an escape, but the house had already closed in around me. The hallway stretched out in front of me, but it felt endless. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows reaching out like hands trying to pull me into them. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. But there was nothing there, just the empty air, the cold air. I could feel it, the presence, right behind me, as if something was standing just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around. It's too late, the voice whispered again, closer this time. You're already one of us. I ran, my feet slamming against the floor. But no matter how fast I moved, the house seemed to stretch out in front of me, its walls shifting and warping. The door to the outside, the one I had come to earlier, was nowhere to be found. Instead, the house felt like it was swallowing me whole. The footsteps grew louder, the sound of them now unmistakable, like a slow, deliberate march toward me. I could hear breathing too, deep and ragged, coming from behind the walls. I couldn't escape. I couldn't outrun it. I stumbled into the kitchen, my mind spinning, my hands trembling as I fumbled for anything that could help me. The drawers were empty, the cabinets barren. There was nothing left, nothing but the feeling that I was being watched, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Then I saw it. On the table, a single candle, its wick still burning with a faint, flickering flame. I hadn't noticed it before. It hadn't been there earlier. I moved toward it instinctively, drawn to it by some unseen force. But as my hand reached for it, the flame flickered wildly and the room plunged into darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. The candle was gone, and then the footsteps returned. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air had become thick with the presence of something ancient, something hungry. It was close now, closer than ever, and I knew deep down that I had run out of time. The thing that had haunted this house had found me, and it wasn't going to let me leave. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't escape. And just as I felt the cold grip of death closing in on me, everything went black. The last thing I heard was the sound of the door creaking open. Again, and then nothing. I woke up outside, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My clothes were torn, my body bruised. I had no memory of how I got here, but I knew. I knew asterisk. The house was still out there waiting. I could still hear the footsteps, still feel its presence. And I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it hadn't finished with me yet. I had no idea how long I'd been lying there on the cold ground, my body trembling uncontrollably. My heart was still racing, but the fear wasn't the same. It was something deeper, something more ingrained. My mind was struggling to piece things together, but it was like trying to grasp at shadows. I sat up slowly, my hands pressed against the rough pavement, and looked around. The street was empty, the familiar houses lining both sides in their quiet stillness. There was no sign of the house, no sign of the nightmare I had just escaped. It was as if it had never been there at all, but I knew better than to believe that. I could still feel its weight on me, heavy and oppressive, like a dark cloud hovering just out of sight, waiting to descend again. The house was still out there. I could feel it in my bones. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. My mind was a blur, but one thought kept circling, growing louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. I had to leave. I turned away from the street and started walking. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know where I could go. All I knew was that I had to put as much distance between me and that house as possible. But as I walked, the feeling didn't go away. The air around me felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The footsteps from before, they were still there, just beyond my hearing, like a distant echo, always there, always following. I kept moving, faster now, my feet carrying me through the unfamiliar streets. I didn't even know where I was anymore. The neighborhood felt different, like it was slowly twisting, reshaping itself as I moved through it. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A familiar shape just ahead, the house. It stood at the end of the street, looming in the distance like a dark sentinel. The windows were empty, the door ajar, as though it had been waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't have made it this far, couldn't have come back here. It didn't make sense, but there it was, undeniable. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. The world around me seemed to stop moving, as though time itself had frozen. My legs felt heavy, weighed down by something far beyond physical exhaustion. And then I heard it, a voice, soft, whispers in the wind. Come back. The words were clear, but they didn't come from anyone I could see. They felt like they were in my head, in my very soul, pulling me toward the house that had already claimed so much of me. I shook my head. trying to push the voice out of my mind, but it clung to me like a shadow. My eyes remained fixed on the house, unable to tear away. You can't escape. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my mind trapped in the same unbreakable grip that the house had on me. Every fiber of my being screamed for release, but there was nowhere to go. The house was waiting for me. I could feel it. The air around me shifted, colder now, the temperature dropping as the house seemed to draw closer. I could hear the creaking of floorboards, the soft, ominous sound of footsteps in the distance. But they weren't just in the house anymore. They were all around me, closing in, like 1,000 tiny echoes of the same haunting noise. And then I heard it clearly, a voice. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was loud and sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. You left me. I didn't know if it was a memory or if it was happening in real time, but the voice, the words, the tone were unmistakable. It was the same voice that had haunted me for days, the voice that I had tried to escape, the voice of the original owner of the house, the one obsessed with the occult, the one whose presence still lingered. I had been foolish to think I could get away. There was no escaping this. The house wouldn't let me. You belong here. The door to the house creaked open wider, beckoning me inside. I felt my legs begin to move unwillingly, as if some invisible force was pulling me toward the threshold. My heart thudded in my chest as I stepped forward, each movement slow, deliberate. I couldn't stop. I couldn't fight it. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt a wave of coldness wash over me. The temperature dropped even further, the chill seeping deep into my skin, into my bones. The house had changed. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was something else, something ancient, something alive. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the scent of mildew and rot that seemed to be a permanent part of this place. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned as I struggled to take in a breath, but all I could smell was the staleness of death. I turned around, half expecting to see the door still open, the street beyond it. But there was nothing. The door had disappeared, replaced by a long, dark hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were covered in strange symbols, some etched into the wood, others drawn in what looked like blood. The house was changing around me, twisting, reshaping itself. Welcome home. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming presence of the house. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, standing in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, dark, unmoving. The air felt electric, crackling with anticipation, as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath. The figure stepped forward. It was him, the original owner of the house, the one whose obsession with the occult had opened the door to something dark, something evil. He had never left. He had never truly died. He was waiting for me, and I knew in that moment that it was too late. There was no escaping now. The house had claimed me. I couldn't breathe. The figure at the end of the hallway moved toward me, its presence swallowing the space around me. The air grew colder, so cold that my teeth chattered involuntarily. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to respond. It felt as if the house itself had trapped me in its grasp, its walls closing in around me, suffocating me. The man, if he could even be called that anymore, was no longer human. His features were blurred, shifting like a mirage, his form flickering in and out of existence. His eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness, and I felt as if they were drawing me in, pulling me toward him. The darkness seemed to pulse around him, like an unnatural aura, and I could hear whispers in the air, faint and unintelligible, yet unmistakably sinister. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from him, the overwhelming weight of dread pressing down on me with every passing second. You should never have come back. The voice was not his. It was deeper, more distant, like 1,000 voices whispering at once. I couldn't pinpoint where it came from, but it was everywhere, echoing in my mind, in the house, in my very soul. I could feel it, the presence of something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting in this forsaken place for far too long. The man, if he was even a man anymore, stepped forward again, his movements slow, deliberate. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, even as he drew closer. I could hear his footsteps now, heavy and slow, dragging against the floor like something trying to escape its own weight. Every step he took reverberated through the house, shaking the very foundation beneath my feet. You belong to me now. The words were a command, a finality that cut through the air like a knife. His voice, though barely a whisper, was overpowering, seeping into my mind, into my thoughts. I felt a coldness settle deep within me, an emptiness that I couldn't escape. The house was closing in on me, its walls pressing tighter, its floors groaning under the strain of something far too powerful. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the hallway, slamming the door behind me with a force that shook the house to its core. The flickering lights above me went out, plunging the entire space into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of something far deeper within the house, something pulsating with a sickly energy. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. I could hear him now, his voice clearer than before. It wasn't the man's voice anymore, but something else, something older. The walls trembled as the voice grew louder. Asterisk, you cannot escape. You never could, asterisk. And then, in the pitch-black darkness, I felt it. Something cold, something solid, pressing against my back. A hand. No, not a hand. Something else. Something far worse. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the ever-encroaching dark that seemed to close in on me, suffocating me, consuming me. Leave this place. The words weren't from the figure anymore. They were in my head, in my mind, echoing through my very being. It was a command, a forceful push, and I felt my body obeying against my will. My feet were moving, stumbling through the dark hallway, my hands reaching out for anything, but there was nothing. Just the walls, closing in, the air growing colder with every step. I knew I had to get out. I had to escape. But every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into the heart of the house, deeper into its endless maze. The hallway stretched on forever, bending and twisting in impossible angles, the walls shifting with every movement I made. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards beneath me, like footsteps echoing from the past. Footsteps that belonged to someone who was long gone, but not forgotten. You will never leave. I turned, desperately searching for the door, for any sign of escape, but there was nothing. The hallway stretched on, an endless void of darkness that seemed to swallow all light, all hope. I could hear the whispers now, louder, clearer, as if the house itself was speaking to me. You are mine. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get out. But the walls were closing in, the darkness growing thicker, the air colder. My lungs burned as I gasped for breath, but the suffocating weight of the house pressed in on me, pushing me down, suffocating me from all sides. And then I saw it, a door, at the end of the hallway. It was faint, just a silhouette in the dark, but it was there. A way out? I ran toward it, my legs shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached for the door, something grabbed my arm. I screamed, struggling, but the grip was too strong, too cold. It felt like something was pulling me back, dragging me toward the darkness, toward the thing that had been waiting for me all along. I fought, I kicked, but it was no use. The door was out of reach. The darkness closed in, and I was trapped once more. Asterisk, you can't leave. Not now. Not ever, asterisk. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was a figure, standing just behind me, its eyes empty, its mouth open in a silent scream. And then everything went black. I woke up in the bed, in my own bed. But something was different. The room was the same, the familiar walls, the creaking floorboards, but the air felt wrong. It was heavy, suffocating, and the whispers, so soft, so faint, but there. I could hear them, just beyond the edge of my hearing. I wasn't alone. The house was still here. It was waiting, and so was he. The house was never going to let me go. Not ever. Story 2. I didn't expect the house to be like this. It was an old place, clearly, but I didn't mind. After everything that had happened, I wasn't looking for perfection. I just wanted a fresh start, a place where I could get lost in the quiet and put the past behind me. The divorce had shattered me, and the thought of starting over in a new town, with no one around to judge or ask questions, seemed like the perfect escape. The house had been cheap, which was why I'd chosen it. The real estate agent had practically shoved the listing into my hands. "It's a steal," she said, practically whispering it like it was some kind of secret. "The place needs a little work, but it has character." Character, huh? I had arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was sinking behind the trees. The house stood there, tall and quiet, its windows reflecting the dying light in a way that made it look eerie. The paint on the exterior was peeling, and the porch was sagging under the weight of years. It wasn't much to look at, but I was too exhausted to care. I just wanted to unpack and settle in. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, a welcome that seemed fitting. The floors inside were old hardwood, worn and creaky, but I liked it. It felt lived in. I could hear the sounds of the house settling around me, the soft groan of the beams, the whisper of the wind through cracks in the walls. It felt like a place that had secrets to tell, stories of the people who had lived here before me. I made my way through the rooms, dragging boxes behind me and trying to imagine what this place could look like once it was mine. It wasn't much. A small living room, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and 2 bedrooms. One of them would be my office, the other my bedroom. Simple, practical. By the time I finished unpacking, night had fallen. I went to bed early, hoping to get some rest after the long drive. The house seemed quieter at night, the creaks and groans of the day replaced by an eerie stillness. I lay there, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself I wasn't imagining things. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought it was my imagination, a soft, muffled sound, like something scraping against the floorboards. I turned my head, straining to listen, but the sound had stopped. Probably just the house settling. I told myself, old houses make all kinds of noises, but it wasn't the last time I'd hear that sound. The next day, I met Mrs. Stevens. She lived 2 doors down, a thin woman with gray hair pulled tightly into a bun. She seemed nice enough, though there was something odd about the way she looked at me when we spoke, like she was studying me, trying to figure me out. "Well," she said, her voice low, almost as if she were sharing a secret, "I see you've moved into the old place." I nodded, unsure where the conversation was headed. She paused, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "You know, people don't stay in that house long. Strange things happen there." I felt a chill. It wasn't like she was trying to scare me, but the way she said it, the seriousness in her tone, made my stomach drop. "Strange things?" I asked, my voice casual, though my heart was beginning to race. "Oh, sounds, footsteps, voices maybe. People have run out of there in the middle of the night, babbling about things following them. The house has a history," she said, her eyes narrowing as if she were about to say something more, but then she stopped herself. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Old houses are like that, I guess. They creak and groan, right?" She didn't smile. "Maybe, but just be careful. People who live there, they tend to leave in a hurry." I nodded, uncomfortable, but said nothing more. As she walked back to her house, I stared at the old building for a long time, the words lingering in the back of my mind. But I wasn't scared, at least not yet. That night, I heard the sound again, the faint, scraping noise, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. This time, it was louder, closer. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just a house. Old houses make noises, after all. It was probably the wind or the pipes. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the sound, but it didn't stop. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth outside my door. My mind raced, and for the first time, the house didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like something else, something I wasn't ready for. But I wasn't ready to leave either. Not yet. The next few days were a blur. I tried to get settled into the rhythm of my new life, but the house seemed to be playing tricks on me. It started with little things. A door I thought I'd closed was ajar when I passed by, a window slightly open that I could have sworn I'd locked. I dismissed them, thinking it was just my mind adjusting to a new place, the unfamiliarity making me overly cautious. Then there were the noises, the creaking floorboards, the faint scraping sounds that seemed to come from within the walls. But it wasn't just those, it was the footsteps. Always at night, always when I was alone, they echoed through the house. Heavy, deliberate, like someone was walking up and down the hall just outside my bedroom door. And when I'd get up to check, there would be nothing. I didn't tell anyone about it. I wasn't ready to sound crazy. Mrs. Stevens' warning still echoed in my head, but I couldn't bring myself to ask her more. Maybe it was just a coincidence, right? An old house, some old noises, nothing more. But one afternoon, as I was unpacking the last of the boxes in the spare bedroom, I heard a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated. It knocked again, more insistently this time, followed by a soft voice. "Hello? Anyone home?" I walked over to the door, pulling it open to reveal an older man standing on the porch. He had kind eyes, but his face looked tired, as if he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were neat but worn, and he gave me a polite smile. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, "but I thought I'd stop by and introduce myself. I'm Greg, your neighbor." I nodded. "Nice to meet you. I just moved in, so I guess I don't know much about the area yet." He gave me a small nod. "Well, welcome to the neighborhood. I just wanted to check on you, especially since you're in that house." My stomach tightened at the mention of it. That house! Greg looked over his shoulder, as if ensuring no one was listening. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You've heard the stories, right?" I shifted uncomfortably. I'd heard a few rumors, sure, but nothing that seemed serious. Still, something about the way he was looking at me made me hesitate before I answered. "I've heard things, but I'm sure it's nothing." He seemed to study me for a moment, then sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but if you're going to be living there, you should know. There's a history with that house. The people who lived there before you, they didn't last long. People in the neighborhood, they've seen things." My heart began to race. I nodded slowly. "What kind of things?" He glanced over his shoulder again, as though the house itself might be listening. And then he leaned in, lowering his voice even more. "Strange noises, cold spots. People have heard footsteps, seen shadows moving in the windows when no one was there. It's like the house itself is alive. And sometimes it calls to you. At night, especially." I could feel my skin prickling, but I kept my voice steady. "What do you mean, it calls to you?" Greg shook his head, looking at the ground. "I don't know for sure, but there are stories. People who stayed there have gone missing, or left in such a state that they couldn't even talk about what happened. It's like the house gets into your head. They say it's cursed." I took a step back, my thoughts spinning. Curse? Greg didn't respond right away, just stood there, looking at me. His expression was grave, like he was trying to decide how much to tell me. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a house. It's who built it. The original owner was obsessed with things beyond this world. He dabbled in rituals, dark stuff. People say he opened something unnatural. The air felt thick, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Who was he? Greg shifted on his feet, looking at me for a moment before answering. His name was Edward Rayner, a recluse. Never spoke to anyone, but he spent all his time in the house. Some say he was trying to summon something that shouldn't be here. And then, well, one day he was gone. The house stayed empty for a long time after that, but people still talk about him, about what he did. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. Why did you stay then? Why not leave? Greg hesitated, his eyes glancing toward the house again, as though he were considering something. I don't know. Some people can't leave. It calls to them, I guess. It did to me. And it's not like I'm scared of the place. But there's something wrong about it. A chill ran down my spine, and I had to force myself to take a breath. So, what are you saying? Should I leave? Greg studied me for a moment. I'm not saying you should leave. I just wanted you to know what you're dealing with. That house, it's not just a house. It's something more. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there on the porch, the air growing colder around me. I went back inside, my mind racing with everything he'd told me. I didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to believe that the house could be anything other than just old. But as the night drew closer, I could hear the creaking of the floorboards again, the scratching sound from deep within the walls. The footsteps, slow and heavy, just outside my door. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that I might be losing my mind, or the idea that something truly was wrong with the house. Either way, I was already in too deep. The footsteps didn't stop. Night after night, they grew louder, more persistent. I tried to ignore them at first, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the old house settling, the wind moving through the rafters. But the longer I stayed, the harder it became to brush it off. These sounds weren't random. They followed a pattern, heavy, measured, like someone was walking back and forth, pacing the halls, waiting. By the end of the second week, I couldn't sleep anymore. Every creak, every scratch, every faint sound had me on edge, heart pounding, eyes wide open in the dark. I spent most of the night sitting up in bed, listening to the silence after the footsteps stopped, wondering if something was waiting, lurking just outside my door. I tried talking to Mrs. Stevens again, hoping maybe she had some answers, but she was tight-lipped when I brought up the noises. She'd simply give me a look, one that was both sympathetic and wary, and tell me to take care of myself. The rest of the neighbors had the same nervous energy, avoiding any mention of the house or its past. One afternoon, I was going through some of the boxes in the attic, hoping to find something to distract myself, when I stumbled upon a dusty old trunk hidden in the corner. It was covered in cobwebs, the wood worn and scratched like it had been forgotten for decades. I almost ignored it, but something about the trunk pulled me in. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd normally find in an attic. Most of the other things had been old furniture, boxes of things I'd never touch again, a few faded family photos. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the trunk. Inside, I found a collection of old books and papers. They were yellowed and fragile, as if the weight of time had pressed them into dust. But it was a leather-bound journal that caught my attention. It was worn, its edges frayed, and the pages inside were covered in faint, spidery writing. Curiosity, or maybe desperation, pushed me to open it. The first few pages were filled with rambling notes about everyday things, shopping lists, random thoughts, the kinds of things that made no sense out of context. But as I flipped further, the tone changed. The handwriting became jagged, frantic. The words were disjointed, like the writer's mind was beginning to unravel. She watches. I hear her in the walls. One entry read, "I shouldn't have done it. The door is open now." My breath caught in my throat. The writing was erratic, scattered, but there was an unmistakable sense of fear in every word. It was as if the person writing the journal had started to lose their grip on reality, or worse, had realized something terrible was happening but couldn't stop it. The name at the top of the page sent a cold wave through me. Edward Rayner, the original owner of the house. I turned the page, desperate to know more, but the next entry made my stomach drop. She's here. The ritual, he said it would be enough, but it's worse. I can hear her at night, scratching at the door. The others, they left. They ran. I can feel her watching me. I must finish it. The door must stay open. She must not leave. My fingers trembled as I held the journal, my mind racing. This wasn't just the ramblings of someone losing their mind. This was something else. Something terrifying. I kept reading, my heart racing with each page. The journal detailed rituals. Rituals that made no sense but were dark, disturbing. There were mentions of summoning, of doors being opened, of things that shouldn't be called. It all sounded like nonsense, but the fear in the words felt too real. She is inside. She is watching. She waits. I can hear her. The last few pages were nothing but wild scribbles. I couldn't make out the words anymore. It was like the journal had become an extension of the writer's panic, the pen moving faster than the thoughts. The last entry was simply, "Help, please." I slammed the journal shut, a shiver running down my spine. The air in the attic felt colder, heavier, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I looked around, my mind reeling. It couldn't be real. This couldn't be real. But the journal had been there for decades, untouched by anyone. And the name, Edward Rayner, kept echoing in my mind. I had to know more. I had to understand what had happened here. I took the journal downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the pages again, reading the entries over and over. The words made my skin crawl, the sense of dread building like a weight on my chest. The rituals, the warnings, the fear, it all pointed to something I hadn't been prepared for. That night, when I went to bed, the house felt different. The creaks and groans seemed louder, more deliberate. The footsteps outside my door started up again, slow and heavy. But this time, I wasn't the only one listening. Something was in the house with me, something that had been here long before I ever moved in. And whatever it wasn't going away. I pulled the covers up, trying to ignore the growing feeling that I was being watched. The air in the room was growing colder, the temperature dropping even though the heat was on. The footsteps continued, and I could swear I heard a faint scratching noise, like something was clawing at the door, trying to get in. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was pounding in my chest, and my eyes darted nervously around the room. Suddenly, the scratching stopped, but then I heard something else, a whisper, soft, breathless. "Come closer." I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't the wind. It was real, and it was calling to me. I lay still, my heart hammering in my chest. The whisper had been faint, almost as if it had come from the very walls, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. But there was no mistaking it. It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something was in the room with me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but there was no rational explanation for what was happening. The journal had already filled my thoughts with dread, and now this whisper? I was no longer alone in this house. Whatever had been lurking in the corners was getting bolder, more confident. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until I could no longer bear it. My body was frozen, as though some primal instinct was telling me not to react, not to give in. But I couldn't take it anymore. I forced myself to move, my fingers gripping the sheets as I slowly slid out of bed. The room was darker than it had been when I had first gotten in, the faint moonlight from the window barely illuminating the corners. I crept to the door, my feet barely making a sound as I stepped onto the cold wooden floorboards. The scratching had stopped, but I still felt the weight of something heavy pressing down on me. I reached for the doorknob, my hands shaking. I had to know what was causing the noise, what was trying to get in. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly twisted the knob, the door creaking loudly in protest. But there was nothing. The hallway outside was empty, silent. I let out a shaky breath, half relieved, half disappointed. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I had just imagined it. I was about to step back inside my room when I heard it again, a whisper, this time louder, sharper. "Come closer, you're not safe." I jerked back, my heart skipping a beat. The voice wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the room. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing, just the empty darkness of the room, my bed still neatly made, my dresser against the far wall. The air felt wrong, colder now, like it had a life of its own. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, trapped between the rational part of me that wanted to scream and the other part that told me to run. But run where? The house itself was a problem, and I was stuck in the middle of it, unable to escape. I thought about the journal, about the things Edward Rayner had written, the rituals, the door, the thing he had unleashed. Was it still here, waiting for me to unlock it, to bring it to life again? I couldn't stop myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the nightstand drawer. Inside, I found the flashlight I'd been using earlier when I had first discovered the journal. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness and landing on the floorboards. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from one corner to the other. Nothing, but then I saw something, a faint imprint, like a footprint on the wooden floor. A cold, wet mark, as if something had stepped there. I knelt closer, my breath catching as I traced the edges of the imprint with my fingers. It was fresh. I stood quickly, my mind spinning. How could that be? I hadn't heard anything, hadn't felt anything. Yet there it was, a clear, wet footprint, as if someone or something had stepped into the room while I was standing by the door. I backed away from it, my heart racing again, every sense on high alert. The house was old, but this wasn't just creaky floors or drafts. This was something else, something alive. Suddenly, the door to my room slammed shut with a deafening bang. I screamed, my body lurching forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The flashlight fell from my hand and clattered to the floor. Darkness swallowed me whole. I fumbled around in the dark, trying to grab the flashlight again, but my hands were shaking so badly that it took several tries before I finally managed to click it back on. The light flickered for a moment, then steadied, revealing the room once more. And there, standing at the foot of my bed, was a figure. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, some nightmare my exhausted brain had conjured. But no, this was real. It was a silhouette, tall and dark, its features indistinct, as though it had no face at all. It loomed there, its presence suffocating, filling the room with an oppressive coldness that made my skin crawl. The air was thick, heavier than it should have been. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath, even though I wasn't near an open window. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then it spoke. "Come closer, or I will make you." The voice was a rasping whisper, but it was no longer just in my head. It was in the room, coming from the figure, echoing in the walls. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, unable to escape. I could feel it, the thing standing there, waiting, watching me. The air was suffocating. I could hear it breathing now, heavy and labored, like it was right in front of me, inches away. The cold was unbearable, biting into my skin like icy fingers. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. I was left alone, standing in the middle of the room, staring at the empty space where it had been. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of it, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was Whatever had been haunting this house, it wasn't finished with me yet, and I had just crossed a line I couldn't come back from. I had no choice but to leave, but as I turned to grab my things, I heard the whisper again, this time much closer, right behind me. "Don't leave." I froze. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was following me. I couldn't breathe. The whisper had come from right behind me, too close, like someone was standing in the very space I occupied. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, expecting to see it. The thing from the foot of my bed, the shadow with no face. But there was nothing. The room was empty, eerily still. I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me, and collided with the dresser. My breath came in shallow gasps, panic flooding my senses. Was I losing my mind? Had I finally gone over the edge? Or was this thing really haunting me, following me wherever I went? I couldn't just sit there, frozen in fear. I had to do something. I had to figure out what was going on. The house was cursed. There was no other explanation. And if there was any chance of escaping whatever was that haunted these walls, I needed to know everything. I needed to understand the history of this place, the origins of the terror that was closing in around me. The journal. I turned and rushed toward the old desk where I had placed the journal earlier, my hands shaking as I opened the drawer. The pages inside were yellowed and fragile, but I didn't care. I flipped through them quickly, scanning the cryptic, disjointed sentences. Most of it was difficult to read. The ink faded with time, but there were enough details to make me realize this wasn't just some eccentric collection of ramblings. It was a record, a warning. Edward Rayner had written about things I couldn't understand, things I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. He spoke of rituals that involved blood incantations, symbols drawn in the dark. He had been obsessed with the occult, desperate to unlock some ancient power, and it seemed, from what I gathered, that he had succeeded. I paused on one particular passage. Asterisk, the door is open. They're coming for me. I thought I could control it, but now it's free. It whispers in the walls. It moves when I sleep. It is waiting patient for what I have promised it. Asterisk, a chill ran down my spine as I read those words. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was a gateway, a doorway to something that had been unleashed. I turned the page, my eyes widening as I read further. Asterisk, the ritual must be completed, or it will never leave. I don't know if I can do it, but I will try. The door must remain closed. No one can enter, no one can leave. Asterisk, the door he had opened, the one that had let whatever was into this world. I could feel the weight of the words pressing down on me. This was real. Edward Rayner hadn't just lost his mind. He had summoned something, and now it was after me. I didn't know how or why, but it was clear. The house wasn't just haunted. It was cursed. I had to leave. But could I? Would that even help? The journal spoke of a curse that wouldn't be lifted so easily. Once the door was opened, there was no going back. I had no answers, only questions. And the answers I was finding terrified me more than the whispers in the dark. I slammed the journal shut, feeling the weight of its contents settle over me like a shroud. My hands were clammy, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. I needed more. I needed to know what happened to Edward Rayner, what happened to the house after he had disappeared. Had anyone else lived here since him? Were they all gone now? Did they vanish, too, like he had? Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. My heart lurched in my chest. I froze. The footsteps weren't a trick of the house settling. They were too deliberate, too heavy. Someone or something was walking toward me. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the journal and shoved it into my bag, my hands trembling as I hurried toward the door. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I knew I couldn't stay in this room, this house, any longer. I opened the door, peering down the dark hallway. The footsteps were closer now, too close. I stepped out, holding my breath, trying to make as little noise as possible. My pulse was pounding in my ears. The air felt thick, oppressive, and then, in the distance, I saw it. The shadow, a silhouette moving toward me. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I turned and bolted down the hallway, toward the stairs, praying I could make it out of the house before whatever was reached me. The stairs creaked under my feet, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my heart racing, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The door was just ahead, but before I could reach it, a cold gust of wind slammed against me, pushing me back. I stumbled, losing my balance, and fell hard against the wall. The door, the only way out, was suddenly locked. The air grew colder, colder than it had ever been before. My breath came in short, visible bursts. I tried to handle again, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. "Don't leave." The whisper came again, louder this time. It echoed off the walls, reverberating in my skull. I turned to look behind me, but there was no one there. Just a dark, empty hallway stretching out into the darkness. The cold was unbearable now, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I could hear something else, too, a faint scratching, like nails against wood coming from the walls. The sound was maddening, relentless. Then I saw it, the door at the end of the hall, the one that had once been locked, the one I had never dared to open, was slowly creaking open. I had to leave. I had to get out. But as I turned to the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was there. It stood at the edge of the yard, watching. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze piercing me, feeling like it was digging into my very soul. The door creaked wider, and I knew then that I wasn't going to escape, not unless I faced whatever had been waiting for me, and I didn't know if I was ready to. The darkness seemed to stretch and press in from all sides. I felt like I was suffocating under its weight, my lungs constricting with every breath I took. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could see my breath in front of me, visible and sharp. But it wasn't just the cold that made my skin crawl. It was a feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't dare look back at the open door. I couldn't, not when I could feel it calling to me, beckoning me toward whatever was hiding inside. My heart was racing, thudding so loud I thought it might drown out the sounds of the house itself, of the footsteps that had stopped, the faint scratching at the walls, the whispering that had started again, louder this time, as if it was coming from the very air around me. "Don't leave," the voice crooned, its tone sickly sweet, like it knew my every fear. I tried the door again. Locked. Of course. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even shocked anymore. The house had been toying with me, keeping me trapped here, closing off every exit like a predator herding its prey. The figure in the yard was still there, standing motionless beneath the darkened sky. I could feel its eyes, like burning embers, fixated on me from a distance. I didn't know if it was human or something else entirely, but I knew it was no good. No good at all. I took a step back, my feet dragging over the floor, which groaned in protest under my weight. The house was alive in its own way, responding to my every movement. The wooden beams in the ceiling creaked ominously, as if the very structure was shifting and groaning under some invisible pressure. I looked around desperately, my gaze flicking over the dim, flickering lights. I needed a way out, a way to break free from this nightmare. But there was no escape, not from the house, not from whatever had been unleashed inside it. A sound broke through my thoughts, sharp and sudden, something scraping across the floor behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in place, as if my very soul was fighting against the primal instinct to turn around and look. But I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes trailing down to the floor behind me. Nothing, just the old wooden planks, warped and cracked with age. The noise had stopped, but the feeling of eyes watching me, had only grown stronger. A faint, bitter smell filled the air, like something rotting in the walls, something dead and decayed. That was when I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible sound, coming from the room at the end of the hall. The same room I had seen the figure near earlier. A whisper. It was so faint at first, I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. Come closer. My heart skipped a beat. I could feel it in my bones. The voice wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone. My feet glued to the floor, my breath shallow and erratic. But I knew deep down that I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let the house win. Whatever it was that had been chasing me, whatever evil had been summoned by the cursed rituals of Edward Rayner, it would never stop until it had me. I had to face it. But how? How could I confront something I didn't even understand? Something that had existed in the shadows for so long. Something that defied the very laws of reality. The door at the end of the hallway creaked again. I didn't know if it was the house settling or if something else was at work. But the sound felt deliberate, like an invitation. I swallowed hard, the dry, bitter taste of fear in the back of my throat. Every instinct told me to run, to find a way out, but I knew better. There was no running from this, no escaping it. The only way out was through. I slowly made my way down the hall, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The room beyond was completely dark, the air thick with a sense of dread. I could hear my own heartbeat, echoing in my ears as I turned the knob. The door opened with a creak, and I stepped inside. The air was colder here, frigid and stale. The room was empty, save for the strange, twisted shapes in the corners, the shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. My skin prickled as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was here. It had to be. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from corner to corner, trying to make sense of what was happening. And that's when I saw it. The figure was standing in the far corner, cloaked in shadows, its face obscured. But I knew it was waiting for me. It was waiting to make its move. Don't be afraid, the voice whispered, soft and coaxing. But I could hear the malice underneath, the darkness that bled through every syllable. I won't hurt you yet. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mouth was dry, my throat tight with terror. I could feel it, the pressure building in the room, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. Who are you? I finally managed to rasp, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long silence, a heavy, suffocating stillness. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. And then, in a voice that sounded like it came from the very walls, from the house itself, it spoke. You already know, it said. A sharp chill ran through me, a freezing sensation that cut to the bone. And then, in an instant, the figure was right in front of me, too close, too fast, like it had moved through the air itself. I felt the cold rush of air, and I could hear the sound of its breath, slow and deep, like it was savoring my fear. My body went numb. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The figure reached out, its cold fingers brushing against my cheek. I felt the weight of its touch, the icy cold that seemed to seep into my very soul. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I was alone again, but the fear didn't go away. It lingered, deep in my chest, in the pit of my stomach. Whatever had been in this house, whatever had been waiting for me, it wasn't finished yet. I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, just needing to escape. But I knew deep down, even as I fled, that I wasn't going anywhere. The house would never let me leave. The house was closing in on me. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into some invisible trap. The walls pressing in, the floorboards groaning in protest beneath my weight. The heavy air was thick with the remnants of whatever had happened here. The remnants of that curse I could no longer ignore. I didn't even know where I was anymore. The hallways twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The rooms blending into one another, a maze of old, creaking wood and long-forgotten memories. I could feel it behind me, whatever had been following me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The house was alive, and it knew I was trapped. I had to find something, anything, a way to understand what was happening, to learn the truth about this place, about the horrors that had been buried here for so long. There had to be an answer somewhere. I refused to believe that I was just a pawn in whatever game this house had been playing. I had to fight back. I had to confront it head on. I made my way to the small study that I had found a few days ago, the one room in the house that hadn't yet been touched by the darkness. It was almost normal in there, with old books lining the shelves and dusty furniture that looked as if it hadn't been used in decades. But something about it felt off, like it had been waiting for me, too. My eyes fell on the old wooden desk in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers and items that had been abandoned long ago. Among them was a leather-bound journal. It looked out of place, pristine compared to the rest of the mess that filled the room. I walked over and picked it up, my hands trembling as I opened the first page. The handwriting was messy, rushed, like the writer had been in a hurry, scribbling down thoughts before they were consumed by whatever madness had overtaken them. The words were strange, disconnected, almost as if they were meant to confuse, to deceive. Asterisk, the house has chosen me. It calls to me in my dreams, whispers in the dark. The rituals must continue. It is the only way to appease it, to give it what it wants. Asterisk, I flipped through the pages, each one more frantic than the last. The entries spoke of an obsession with the occult, of rituals performed in secret, of doors open to things beyond human comprehension. The writer, Edward Rayner, had been the original owner of the house. His descent into madness had begun long before I moved in, but it seemed like the house had claimed him, and now it was after me. Asterisk, I hear the footsteps. I hear the whispering. It is growing stronger. The rituals are not enough to hold it back anymore. I fear it is too late. Asterisk, as I read, my skin began to crawl. This wasn't just a journal. It was a warning, a desperate plea for help from someone who had seen the horrors the house could unleash. And now, those horrors were coming for me. I couldn't stop reading, even though every word made my stomach twist with dread. Asterisk, I have seen the figure in the dark. It watches me as I sleep. It waits for the moment when the house will take me, as it has taken so many before me. But I will not go quietly. I will not be consumed. Asterisk, Edward's last entry was the most chilling. Asterisk, if you are reading this, it is already too late. The house is awake. It has claimed me, and now it will claim you. Asterisk, I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking violently. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls were closing in on me. I could still hear the whispering, distant but unmistakable, and the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. I wasn't safe here. The house had chosen me, just like it had chosen Edward. And now, there was no escaping it. I needed to get out, but the question was, where would I go? The house had already taken control of everything, every room, every corner. There was no place left to hide. I could feel it now. Something cold brushing against the back of my neck. A presence. It was there, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake, to slip up just long enough for it to pounce. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, dimly lit study. The faint smell of decay hanging in the air. I had to leave, but the front door was locked, the windows sealed shut, and I knew that no matter where I went, I wouldn't be able to escape. The house wouldn't let me. I had to face it. I stood up from the desk, clutching the journal in my hands, my mind racing. There had to be something I could do, some way to break the curse, to stop the house from claiming me like it had claimed Edward. The answer was in the rituals, the ones he had written about. If I could find a way to undo whatever had been done, maybe, just maybe, I could break free. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't know where to begin. The rituals were too complicated, too dangerous. The house had already rejected me. It seemed Every attempt to break free had only led me deeper into its grasp. I was stuck, trapped, and then, just as I was about to make my way to the next room, I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It came from behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I could feel it now, the presence in the room. It was close, too close, like it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. The whispering grew louder, and then I heard something that froze my blood. A voice low and mocking. You can't run. You can't hide. It's too late. The room went cold. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could feel the weight of the air, thick with fear and anticipation. I slowly turned, half expecting to see nothing, but there, standing just inside the doorway, was the figure I had seen earlier, the same dark, shadowy form that had watched me from across the yard. It was here, in the house, and it wasn't leaving. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in as the figure took a step forward. I couldn't escape. Not this time. I should have known. All this time, I had been running from something I couldn't escape. The house wasn't just alive. It had become part of me, part of my every waking moment. It had been pulling me deeper into its web, slowly, carefully, until there was no way out. The figure in the doorway moved closer, its dark form swirling like smoke, its edges blurred as if it couldn't quite decide whether it was truly here or still a part of the shadows. It wasn't like anything I had seen before, not a person, not a ghost. It was a presence, a feeling more than a shape. I could hear the rustle of something, like dry leaves being stirred by the wind, coming from where the figure stood. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. My entire body was paralyzed, every instinct telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only stare at it, mesmerized by the unnatural chill creeping across the room. The figure took another step forward, its footfall soft, like a whisper on the wooden floor. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence growing, pressing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of its dark energy. The air felt thick, too thick to breathe, as if the house itself was holding me in place. You shouldn't have come here. The voice came again, only this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was louder, more distinct. It was a voice that scraped at my mind, a voice that sounded familiar and wrong all at once. I felt the weight of those words settle deep within me, a cold truth that sank into my bones. I had been warned, by the neighbors, by the journal. Hell, even by the house itself. It had been calling to me, pushing me toward this moment. I had thought I could find a way out, that there was some escape from the curse, from whatever darkness had taken root here. But now, with the figure standing before me, I knew. There was no escape. Not now. Not anymore. I struggled to move, but my body remained stiff. The figure was getting closer. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, could hear its voice rumbling in my ears. You think you can break the curse? It said, each word laced with mockery. You're just like the others. All of you. You'll join the rest of them, the ones who never leave. I couldn't speak, couldn't even form a coherent thought. My eyes were glued to the figure, and I felt a deep, primal fear creeping through me. It wasn't just an entity, it wasn't just a ghost. It was something older, something powerful, something that had been here far longer than I could comprehend. The house had never let go of its victims. It had consumed them all, one by one, and now it was coming for me. And then a sudden thought hit me. Edward's journal, the rituals, the keys to stopping this thing. Maybe, just maybe, if I followed them, if I did exactly as he had written, I could reverse what had been done. I could banish this thing, break the house's hold. I scrambled toward the desk, my hands shaking as I pulled the journal open again. The pages were frantic, full of desperate scribbles. But I had to focus. There had to be something here, something I could use. As I read, the room seemed to grow darker, colder. The shadows pressed in closer, suffocating me. My hands shook as I turned the pages, each entry more disjointed than the last, until I found it. One last ritual, one last attempt to force the house to release its grip on me. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. It was dangerous. And even as I read the instructions, I knew that doing this could either save me or kill me. A voice rang in my ears, a hiss from the shadows. You'll die here, just like them. You can't stop it. I didn't care. I had no other choice. I stood up, clutching the journal, the words still swimming in my mind. The ritual, the candles, the incantation. I rushed to the center of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was closer now, its form more solid, more tangible, its dark presence looming over me. I gathered what I needed, candles from the shelf, matches from my pocket, and set them in a circle on the floor. I didn't know if I had the strength to see this through, but I had to try. I had to fight back, even if it was the last thing I ever did. The figure stood, watching me, its eyes hidden behind the shadowed face. The growling noise was louder now, like a beast ready to pounce, and I could feel the air growing colder still. But I focused. I had to. This was my only chance. I lit the candles, one by one, the small flames flickering and dancing in the dim light. As I completed the circle, I stood in the center, the journal open in my hands. I spoke the incantation, my voice trembling but firm. The words felt foreign, strange on my tongue, but I forced them out. The house groaned, like it was waking from a long, deep sleep. The temperature dropped so suddenly. I could see my breath fog in front of me. The figure flinched, retreating slightly, as if the very air had become hostile. But then it moved again, faster this time. The growling sound grew louder, the walls themselves shaking as if the house was ready to implode. I kept speaking the words. The room was spinning, the shadows dancing wildly. I didn't know if I was doing it right. I didn't know if this would work. But the figure was getting closer, its form twisting and warping in the flickering candlelight. I felt it then, the cold, a cold that went beyond physical sensation, deep into my soul, freezing my very thoughts. And then, silence. Everything stopped. The shadows stopped moving. The growling ceased. The house, the figure, it all stopped. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. The candles burned low, their flames flickering erratically, but the figure was gone. The oppressive darkness had lifted. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, almost drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. Run. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my things, bolted for the front door, and didn't look back. But as I ran, I could hear it, the footsteps echoing behind me. Closer, closer. I wasn't free. Not yet. The house hadn't let me go. Not yet. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to stretch on forever, its walls twisting, bending, like they were trying to stop me, to keep me here. I could hear the footsteps behind me, soft at first, but growing louder with every step. The shadow, the thing I had been trying to outrun, was still there, following me, hunting me. I reached the front door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the old doorknob. The wood felt cold under my fingertips, like the house itself was trying to hold me in place. I pushed with all my strength, but the door wouldn't budge. I pounded against it, my fists banging on the wood, the sound echoing through the empty halls. But the door didn't move. It was locked. I wasn't getting out that way. I turned, my mind racing. The windows, maybe I could break one, climb through. But as I ran toward the nearest one, I saw the figure again, standing in the hallway, its form dark and looming, blocking my way. It had been waiting for me, always waiting. You can't leave, the voice whispered, low and guttural. You're not allowed to leave. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach dropping. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of those words. I was trapped. The house wasn't just holding me here. It was keeping me, imprisoning me in its suffocating grip. I wasn't going anywhere. But then, something strange happened. As I stood there, staring at the figure, I felt a shift, a change in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The oppressive weight that had been crushing me for days was starting to lift just a little. The cold, the darkness. It wasn't as overwhelming as it had been before. The figure took a step forward, its shadow stretching across the hallway. But I didn't move. Instead, I forced myself to look at it, to face it. "You can't keep me here," I said, my voice shaking, but louder than before. "I'm not staying. I'm not your prisoner." The figure didn't respond, but I could feel it. Something was changing. The house itself was responding to me. The walls groaned, the floor beneath my feet shifting, as if it, too, was uncertain of what was happening. I stepped forward, my legs trembling beneath me, but I pushed through the fear. This was it. This was my chance. I had to keep moving. I had to break free. I reached for the front door again, this time with more determination, and to my surprise, it opened, slowly, creaking as if it were reluctant to let me go. But it opened. I hesitated for just a moment, the fear gnawing at me, whispering that I wasn't really free. But I couldn't let that doubt stop me. I had to escape. With a burst of adrenaline, I shoved the door open and ran. My feet hit the ground outside, the cool night air filling my lungs. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark, silent. But I could feel it. I could feel its presence still, like it was watching me, waiting for the moment when I would falter, when I would look back. I didn't look back. I ran down the front steps, my legs aching, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I had to get away. I had to leave it all behind. As I ran down the overgrown path that led to the street, I felt something strange, something I hadn't felt in days. A sense of freedom, a glimmer of hope. Maybe I had escaped. Maybe I was finally free. But just as I reached the end of the path, something made me pause. A sound, a whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But no, it was real. It was coming from the house. It wasn't a voice, not quite. It was something else, a strange, incomprehensible sound, a low hum, vibrating in the air. And then, through the trees, I saw it. The light. It flickered in one of the windows, dim at first, but growing brighter, pulsing with a strange energy. The house had never been this alive before. Something was happening inside it, something I couldn't understand. It was calling to me, pulling at me, just like it had from the very beginning. I couldn't resist. I turned, my body moving on its own against my will. The house stood there, as imposing and sinister as ever. The light from the window blinked again, and I felt a strange pull, a magnetic force dragging me closer. The footsteps were behind me again. This time, they were louder, closer, as if the thing that had been following me was now chasing me, hunting me down. I had to face it. I had to end this. I couldn't let the house take me again. I took one step forward, then another, until I was standing at the door once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't fight it. I pushed the door open and stepped back inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, but there was something else now, a sense of power, a crackling energy in the air. The house was awake, and it was waiting for me. I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I faced whatever it was that had been haunting me all this time. I wasn't free yet. The house was still mine to conquer, but I wasn't going to let it win. Not this time. I would find the truth. I would break the curse. I would free myself. I didn't know how, but I was going to fight until the very end. And that, for the first time since I had set foot in this cursed house, was enough. I wasn't going to give up. Not yet. The house greeted me with a chill, the same oppressive air that had made me feel like I was walking through a nightmare. But this time, it was different. I wasn't stepping into the unknown anymore. I knew the house now, its quirks, its dark secrets. And despite everything, I wasn't afraid. Not entirely. The door shut behind me with a heavy thud, sealing me back inside. My breath caught as I turned, the silence swallowing me whole. There was no creaking of floorboards, no distant whispers or strange noises. For a moment, the house was just still. I walked down the familiar hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The dim light from the hallway flickered overhead, casting long shadows that twisted and shifted, playing tricks on my eyes. But I didn't let it unsettle me. I had come back to confront whatever it was that had been haunting me. I needed answers. The house seemed to pulse with life now, a strange energy filling the air. The walls felt closer, like they were watching me, listening to my every move. As I passed the living room, I noticed a faint outline of something in the corner of my vision, just a fleeting shadow, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the same old creaky furniture, the dusty curtains swaying in the faint breeze. But I knew I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe some sort of clue, something that would explain everything that had happened to me. Maybe the journal or diary the neighbor had mentioned, the one that might shed light on the house's dark history. I made my way to the study, the room where I'd felt the most uneasy, where the air was thick with an ancient presence. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the scent of old paper and mildew filling my nose. The desk sat in the middle of the room, untouched, but I could sense it. Something had been moved. I approached carefully, my heart racing. It was the drawer in the desk. It had been left slightly ajar, as if someone had been through it recently. I pulled it open fully, my fingers brushing over the worn wood. Inside, there was a stack of old papers, yellowed, brittle with age. I hesitated, but then, with a deep breath, I picked them up. The first sheet was a letter, hastily written, the ink smudged in places, as though it had been written in a hurry, or in fear. The words were disjointed, frantic. Underscore, the house is alive. I can feel it watching me. I don't know what I've awakened, but it is hungry. It calls to me in the night, whispers from the walls. I've seen its eyes in the shadows waiting. I must stop it. I must lock it away before it takes everything. I have to finish the ritual. If I don't, it will underscore. The letter trailed off abruptly, the last word illegible, scratched out as if the writer had been too terrified to continue. My skin crawled as I read it, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I flipped through the papers, my hands trembling. There were more letters, more notes, all written by the same hand. But it was the last page that caught my eye. It was a diagram, an intricate, almost otherworldly drawing, depicting symbols I didn't recognize, a series of interconnected shapes and lines. And in the center, there was an eye, a large, unblinking eye, drawn in thick, bold strokes. I stared at it, my mind racing. The drawing seemed to pull at me, urging me to understand. I knew I had seen this before, somewhere in the house, on the walls, hidden beneath the layers of dust and grime. But where? The sound of something heavy crashing upstairs startled me, and I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. It was a sound I knew well, footsteps, but not like before. These were slower, deliberate, heavy, as though something was moving with purpose. I felt the weight of it in my bones. I dropped the papers back into the drawer and rushed toward the stairs, my heart pounding. I had to see what was up there. I had to know. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, each step sounding louder in the silence. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. When I reached the top, I saw it. The door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. I didn't want to go. I wanted to turn around, to leave, to run as far away as I could. But I couldn't. Not now. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was dim, lit only by the faint light from the hallway. But it wasn't empty. There, in the center of the room, was a table. And on the table, an open book. The pages were filled with more of those strange symbols, the same ones from the drawing. But it wasn't the book that caught my attention. It was what was standing next to it, the figure. It was tall, dark, its shape barely discernible in the shadows. Its presence was suffocating, like it was filling the room with its weight. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My mouth went dry as I stepped back, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of there. But I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. I knew it was coming for me. Then, in the silence, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, its voice low and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves scraping across the ground. The words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't look away. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I knew one thing. Whatever it wasn't going to let me leave. Not this time. "Leave now," the figure said, its voice almost pleading. "Before it's too late." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But all I could do was stand there, trapped in the house's grip, waiting for whatever was coming next. The walls seemed to close in around me. And then, in an instant, the figure was gone. Just like that. The room was empty. I turned and bolted out of the room, back down the stairs, my heart racing in my chest. The house felt different now. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't understand. I could feel its presence, like it was everywhere, closing in on me. I needed to leave, but the door at the bottom of the stairs was closed, and I knew deep down that it wouldn't open again. Not for me. Not ever. I stumbled back from the door, my mind reeling. The figure, the words. It all felt like a terrible dream, a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the house settling, of the whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I could feel it, a presence watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. The door, it had been open when I came in. I was sure of it, but now it was shut tight, as if the house itself had locked me in. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, my fingers slipping on the cold metal, the pressure in my chest building with every failed attempt. Panic clawed at me, and I turned around to face the rest of the house, looking for another way out. The hallway stretched before me, its shadows long and distorted, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement at the end. Just a flicker, a shape darting past the doorframe. I spun around, hard in my throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the silence, pressing in from all sides. I backed away from the door, eyes scanning the room. There had to be another exit. There had to be a way out. My mind raced through every possibility, every corner of the house I hadn't yet explored. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with whatever was lurking in the shadows, watching me. Suddenly, I remembered the window in the kitchen, the one that led to the back of the house. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was my only chance. I rushed through the dark hall, the sound of my feet scraping against the old floorboards loud in the silence. The kitchen door creaked open, and I saw it. The window, its frame old and rusted, but just big enough for me to squeeze through. I hurried over to it, my hands fumbling with the latch. It was stiff, resistant, as though the house didn't want me to leave. I pulled harder, my heart racing, the panic rising in my chest like a wave. The window finally gave, groaning as it opened just wide enough for me to crawl through. I didn't hesitate. I climbed up onto the counter, pushing myself through the narrow gap. As I dropped to the ground outside, I gasped for air, my hands shaking violently. I didn't care about the cuts on my arms, the dirt on my clothes. I just needed to get away. I ran, stumbling through the overgrown yard, my footsteps muffled by the grass. Behind me, the house loomed, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring out at me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound the rush of blood in my ears as I ran down the road. The wind carried with it a chill that cut through my clothes, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance as I could between myself and that house. But as I turned a corner, something stopped me, a feeling, a tug at the back of my mind. I slowed, my breath ragged, and looked up at the darkening sky. It was there again, the shadow, the same shape I had seen earlier, darting across the road, barely visible but unmistakable, a figure just on the edge of my vision. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, my feet carrying me faster now, away from the house and whatever was following me. The world around me seemed to warp, the shadows stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the very ground beneath my feet was shifting. I could hear footsteps, but they weren't mine. They were behind me, getting closer, faster. I glanced back, but there was nothing there, just the empty street. The houses lining the road like silent sentinels. But I could feel it. Something was out there in the darkness, watching, waiting. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. The footsteps were louder now, right behind me, and I knew it was coming. I rounded another corner, desperate, when I saw a car up ahead, parked, its lights off. It was my only chance. I rushed toward it, my hand reaching for the door handle. But before I could grab it, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the shadows. I spun around, but nothing was there, just the empty street. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving through the dark. It was unmistakable now. The footsteps, the breath, the feeling of something just behind me, so close I could almost feel its cold touch. I slammed my hand against the car door, praying it would open. It didn't. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled at the handle again, but it was useless. I was trapped. The growl came again, louder, more frantic now, as though whatever was behind me was closing in, hunting me. I could hear its breath, ragged and labored, and I knew this was it. I was going to die here. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the light. A street light flickering just ahead. It was weak, but it was enough to cast a faint glow over the street. I ran toward it, the footsteps growing louder, faster, until I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the sound of something moving quickly through the darkness. I reached the streetlight, stumbling into its circle of pale light. The noise stopped. The air grew still. For a moment, everything was silent, but I didn't trust it. I turned, eyes scanning the darkness, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there. No shadow, no figure. Just the street, empty and cold. I didn't know if it was gone or if it was still out there, waiting. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, I wasn't going back. Not ever. I turned away from the streetlight and kept running, as fast as I could, not looking back. The days that followed were a blur, a strange mix of confusion and terror. I don't know how I managed to get away that night, but I never went back to that house. I couldn't. Something in my gut told me that whatever I had felt, whatever I had experienced, wasn't done with me. It was waiting. The first night I spent in a hotel, I barely slept. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the shadows, something that shouldn't be there. But it was the second night, the night I thought I could finally breathe again, that I realized how deep the fear had burrowed into me. I was lying in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of the house, when I heard it, a sound distant but unmistakable. Footsteps. I froze. I listened harder, the floorboards creaking, slow, deliberate, like someone walking through the house. My heart skipped a beat. It was as if the house had followed me, dragging its horrors with it. But it couldn't be. I was miles away. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, the building settling, or maybe the echo of some noise from outside. But deep down I knew the footsteps didn't belong to the wind. They were too rhythmic, too purposeful. I could almost feel them, like someone was pacing in the hallway just outside my door. I clutched the blanket tighter, my breath shallow, every muscle tense. Then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, but nothing came. The footsteps didn't resume, and I convinced myself it had been nothing, just my mind playing tricks. I finally drifted off to a restless sleep, but the terror lingered. It lingered in the darkness, in the corners of my mind, in the quiet moments when I let my guard down. The following morning, I left the hotel early, not wanting to stay another night. I rented a car and drove aimlessly for hours, just trying to outrun the feeling of being hunted, of being watched. I thought that if I just kept moving, kept putting miles between myself and that house, the fear would fade. But it didn't. No matter where I went, no matter how far I traveled, the feeling followed me. It was a weight I couldn't shake, a shadow that clung to me even in the bright light of day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house, heard the footsteps, felt the breath on my neck. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy, that I had imagined it all, that it was just some bad experience in a strange old house. But I knew better. I had felt it, felt the presence in that house, the one that didn't belong. I had tried to learn more about the house, about its history, about the people who had lived there before me. But everything I found only made things worse. The more I searched, the more I uncovered rumors, whispers of occult rituals, of people driven mad by what they had found within those walls. The original owner, a man obsessed with the occult, had apparently dabbled in dark rituals, opening doors that should never have been opened. And the tenants before me, those who had lived in that house for only a short time, there were stories about them, too. One man had fled in the middle of the night, his mind broken, babbling about curses and shadows. Another had disappeared without a trace, and no one knew what happened to him. It all pointed to the same thing. The house was cursed, and I had been its latest victim. But the more I tried to escape, the more it seemed to follow me. Every night, I heard the footsteps again. Every dark corner seemed to hold something, something waiting, something watching. I couldn't escape it. It was always there, lingering just out of reach, like a dark cloud that wouldn't let me go. And then one day, I found it. I had returned to the house, not because I wanted to, but because I needed answers. I needed to know why it had happened to me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. Maybe a way to break the curse. Maybe some clue that would make it all make sense. But when I opened the door to the house, something felt different. The house was silent. It was the first time since I'd left that it didn't feel alive with presence, with that oppressive weight that had been there before. It was almost as if the house had given up, as if it were empty, waiting for something or someone to fill the void. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything was the same creaking floorboards, the same dust, the same eerie quiet. The air was thick, suffocating, but there was no whispering, no footsteps, just silence. I walked through the rooms, my feet echoing in the emptiness, and that's when I saw it. On the floor, near the fireplace, there was something new, a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I picked it up, wondering who had left it there, wondering if it was mine to find. As I opened the first page, the words blurred in front of my eyes. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic, like someone who had been writing in a hurry, trying to get something out before it was too late. I couldn't make sense of the words at first, but then one sentence caught my eye. Asterisk, the house is alive. It wants us, all of us, and once you've entered, you can never leave, asterisk. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't finish reading. I dropped the journal, my mind racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The house was alive. It was alive, and it wanted me. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the stairs. They were back, but this time, it wasn't the house that was watching me. It was something else. It was as if the air in the room thickened, the temperature dropping with each step that echoed through the house. The steps were slow, heavy, as if someone or something was deliberately making its way toward me. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away from the journal, eyes fixed on the staircase. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and my heart pounded in my chest. Each beat a reminder of the terror that gripped me. There was no escape. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, straining to hear any other sound, but there was nothing. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting, as if it were daring me to move, to acknowledge what was in the dark corners of the stairs. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, trapped in this oppressive stillness, this sense that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The air felt thick, suffocating, like I was breathing in pure fear. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone speaking just out of reach. Leave. It was a voice, but not a voice I recognized. It wasn't human, at least not in the way we think of it. It was distorted, warped, like something trying to speak through the house itself, something ancient and angry. My pulse raced. I forced myself to take a step backward, then another, until I was near the door. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't. I turned and ran, my feet barely touching the floor as I stumbled toward the exit. The house seemed to stretch out in front of me, its walls closing in, its floorboards creaking with every step I took. I could feel the temperature plummeting, the air growing colder, as if the house itself was reaching out to grab me. When I reached the door, I threw it open, slamming it behind me as I bolted out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the car, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the keys to unlock the door. I threw myself into the seat and started the engine without a second thought, speeding away without looking back. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed, that something was right behind me, just out of sight. The whispering voice echoed in my mind, growing louder, more insistent, as if it was calling to me from the depths of the house. I drove for hours, trying to outrun whatever it was that had followed me, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for me to turn around, to admit that I wasn't truly free. By the time I found a place to stay, the night had worn on, but I didn't sleep. How could I? Every creak of the building, every gust of wind, set me into a frenzy. I couldn't relax. My eyes darted to every shadow, every corner of the room, expecting to see something move, to feel something cold and watching. The fear was consuming me, and I knew, deep down, that I could never escape it. The house wasn't just a place. It was a presence. And no matter how far I went, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that cursed house, it would always be with me. As I lay in the bed, wide-eyed and restless, I heard it again. The footsteps, soft at first but unmistakable. They were back, and this time they weren't in the house. They were in my head. The last thing I remember before the terror took me was a single, chilling thought. Asterisk, it's not over. It's never over, asterisk. I woke up with a start, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. My eyes shot open to the dimly lit room, but for a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. The feeling of terror still clung to me, the weight of it pressing on my chest, suffocating me. I glanced around the hotel room, but nothing seemed out of place. No strange shadows, no footsteps, just a silence that seemed to wrap around me like a blanket. But I knew something had followed me, I ran a hand over my face, trying to shake off the nightmare, trying to remind myself that it wasn't real. The house, the footsteps, the voice, they were just figments of my imagination, right? I hadn't really heard them. I hadn't really seen anything. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt like jelly, my whole body unsteady as I moved toward the window. I pulled the curtains aside and stared out at the quiet street below. The morning light filtered through the clouds, casting an eerie glow on everything. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I needed to get away. I needed to leave, but there was no place far enough. No town, no city, no place on this earth where the fear wouldn't follow me. I turned back to the room, my pulse racing as I heard it again. Footsteps. The sound was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't outside. It wasn't the hotel's creaky floors or the sound of other guests moving around. It was coming from inside the room. I whipped around, panic rising like a tide in my chest. The bathroom door creaked open. I froze. I stood there, staring at the door as it slowly swung wider, revealing the dimness of the small bathroom beyond. The air in the room grew heavier, colder, as if the space itself was tightening around me, closing in. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Should I run? My feet felt rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed by a terror that I couldn't explain, couldn't control. And then, just like that, I heard it, a voice, soft, whispering, like it was coming from the deepest corners of my mind, or perhaps from just behind me. You can't escape. The words sent a jolt of cold fear straight through me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. Nothing but silence. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of what I had heard. My hands trembled at my sides, my heart thundering in my chest. It was in my head. The house was still there. The voice was still there. It had never left. I rushed to the door, my legs shaky as I ran out of the room, not caring about anything but getting away. But no matter how fast I moved, no matter how far I ran, I couldn't outrun it. The feeling that it was right behind me, watching me, was unbearable. I found myself standing in the lobby of the hotel, my breath ragged, my chest tight. The receptionist looked up at me with a questioning gaze, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I couldn't explain what was happening to me, not when I wasn't sure myself. I turned and walked out into the daylight, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know where to go. The footsteps were still there, still in my mind, and the voice. You can't escape. I knew then that it wasn't just a house. It was something darker, something ancient and powerful. The house had been the doorway, but whatever had lived there wasn't confined to those walls. It had followed me, and it wasn't going to let me go. As I walked down the street, I tried to keep my head down, tried to ignore the feeling of eyes on me, of being watched from every corner. The world around me seemed distant, blurred, like I was walking through a fog that I couldn't shake off. The footsteps were there, too, right behind me, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath my feet. And then I heard the voice again, clearer this time. It's only a matter of time. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running, keep hiding, before it all consumed me. And as I turned a corner, I looked up to see a familiar sight. The house. It stood there, looming in the distance. My heart dropped in my chest, my body seizing with terror. But I couldn't move. My feet wouldn't obey me. It was impossible. How could it be there? How could I have ended up back here? And then, through the haze of fear, I realized something else. The house hadn't just followed me. It had been waiting for me. I stood there, staring at the house, the weight of its presence pressing on me like a physical force. My heart pounded, a drumbeat in my ears. The house loomed before me, its windows dark and empty, its silhouette sharp against the dimming sky. It was as if it had been watching me this entire time, waiting for me to come back, to acknowledge its existence. But I hadn't come back. Not willingly. I had tried to escape. I had tried to leave it all behind, to outrun the terror. But now I was here, standing in front of it. The footsteps returned. This time, I didn't need to hear them. I could feel them. The heavy thuds vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. I looked down, half expecting to see some invisible force pulling me toward the door. But there was nothing. Just the cold, the silence, and the unrelenting pull of the house. I turned away, my legs trembling beneath me, my mind screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. The house had me in its grasp, and no matter how fast I moved, it would always be there, just out of reach, just waiting. The wind picked up, sending a chill through my bones. And then I heard it again, the voice, "Come home." It wasn't just in my head anymore. The voice echoed from all around me, like the house itself was speaking, calling to me. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away, stumbling as the world seemed to blur and spin. But the ground beneath me was unyielding. It didn't matter how far I tried to retreat. I couldn't escape it. The house had already claimed me. I turned and looked back once more, half expecting to see the shadow of something moving in the windows, a figure watching from behind the glass. But there was nothing, just the house, empty, silent. For a moment, I wondered if I had been imagining it all, if the footsteps, the voice, the cold, it was all just in my head. Maybe I hadn't been followed. Maybe I had just gone crazy. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew that whatever had started in that house hadn't finished with me. The fear, the presence, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was always going to be real. I took a shaky breath and turned my back on the house, stepping away from it, away from the dark that waited for me. But the moment I took a step, I heard it again, the footsteps, and this time they were louder, closer. I quickened my pace, my legs shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The voice was still there, whispering in my ear, a low hum that filled my mind, making it impossible to focus. Come home. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know how to keep going, how to outrun what was following me. I just wanted it to end. But then, just as I was about to break into a run, I heard something else. A door creaked open, slowly. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart dropped into my stomach. The door to the house. It had opened, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a shape barely visible in the fading light, but unmistakable. It was there, watching me, waiting. I turned and ran. I ran without looking back. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I didn't know what I was running from, except that I couldn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs burned with exhaustion. But the footsteps, the voice, it was still there. It would always be there. I didn't know if I would ever truly escape. And as the darkness closed in, I realized that maybe the house hadn't just followed me. Maybe it had never been the house at all. Maybe it was me.